There's a feeling you get when you wait for something immense, a kind of deep, quiet certainty that the moment when it finally arrives will change everything. It is a vibration in the air, a static charge that makes the hair on your arm stand up, not because of fear, but because of recognition. You know deep in your animal brain that the world you are living in today is about to end, and a new, stranger world is about to begin. For the astronomers sitting in the silent, climate-controlled domes scattered across the lonely corners of our planet, that feeling had been building for months. It was a pressure behind the eyes. It was the inability to sleep. It was the way they looked at the night sky, not with professional curiosity, but with a kind of held breath. The source of this feeling had a name, a catalog number that felt too clinical for what it actually was. 3I Atlas. A comet, a visitor. But those words feel small. They feel inadequate. This was not a rock from our familiar solar neighborhood. It was not a piece of debris left over from the birth of Jupiter or Saturn. It was a traveler from the terrifyingly vast, endless black between the stars. It was an object that had been cast out, orphaned, and sent drifting through the void for eons before it stumbled, by chance or by design, into the gravity well of our sun. We knew it was coming. We had been tracking it with obsessive intensity since its initial stunning discovery back in 2024. We had watched it grow from a faint smudge on a CCD sensor into a definitive object, a mathematical reality hurtling toward the heart of our system. Every calculation, every line of code, every simulation running on the supercomputers at NASA and ESA promised a predictable show. We thought we knew the script. We thought we understood the choreography of the cosmos. See, when a comet like this, a massive, icy, dirty snowball, approaches a star, it follows a set of rules that are millions of years old. It is a cosmic contract. The star provides the heat, and the comet provides the reaction. As it falls toward the inner solar system, the sun's heat begins to touch the surface of the frozen wanderer. It wakes it up. The ice, which has been sleeping in the absolute zero of interstellar space for billions of years, suddenly feels the warmth. It doesn't melt into water. In the vacuum of space, it skips the liquid phase entirely. It sublimates. It turns directly from solid ice into expanding gas. This gas explodes outward, dragging dust and rock and ancient grit with it. It forms a beautiful, misty atmosphere around the nucleus, a coma. And then, pushed by the solar wind, it streams behind the object to form a tail. This transformation is measurable. It is predictable. It is the heartbeat of a comet. It is how we read the life story of these ancient wanderers. We look at the gas to see what the comet is made of. We look at the dust to see how old it is. And most importantly, we look at how much light reflects off that misty cloud of debris. That brightness over time, the way the object glows brighter as it gets closer to the sun, is its essential biography. We call it the light curve. The light curve is supposed to be a smooth, climbing line. As the heat rises, the brightness rises. It is simple. It is physics. We expected 3I Atlas to follow the rules. We expected it to brighten smoothly. We expected it to stream its gas and dust like every other natural object we've ever cataloged in the history of astronomy. We expected a spectacular but ultimately understandable light show. But 3I Atlas, as we had learned before, with its strange, massive water output and its inexplicable nickel anomaly, was tired of our rules. It had no interest in our physics. It was an object that had crossed billions of miles and billions of years to deliver a single, unsettling message to our system. And as the freezing winds of late 2025 stripped the leaves from the trees in the northern hemisphere, that message was finally ready to be read. The object was nearing its perihelion, its closest, most intimate pass to the sun. This is the moment of truth for any comet. It is the moment of maximum wakefulness, the greatest heat, the greatest stress. The global network of telescopes was ready. From the high, oxygen-thin deserts of Chile, where the Atacama Large Millimeter Array turns its dishes to the sky, to the frozen, snow-capped peaks of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, every glass eye of humanity was open. In the dark control rooms, illuminated only by the blue wash of LED monitors and the blinking lights of server racks, the new data began to arrive. It wasn't a trickle this time. It wasn't a few pixels of uncertainty. It was a flood of raw information. Spectral lines, brightness measures, heat maps, velocity checks, orbital residuals. Every single detail of the traveler's current state was pouring into Earth's computers via high-speed uplinks. The world held its breath. The scientists leaned in. And then, the quiet, focused certainty in those control rooms began to shatter, because the data was not right. It wasn't just slightly off. It wasn't within the margin of error. It was wrong. It was fundamentally, aggressively wrong. The first thing that stood out, the first sharp, jarring note in the expected harmony of the cosmos, was the reflectivity. It was too low. 3I Atlas was far closer to the sun now. It was plunging through the danger zone, under maximum thermal attack. The solar radiation hitting its surface was intense enough to melt lead. By all the laws of nature, it should be violently active. A huge, brilliant plume of gas and dust should be expanding around it, catching the sunlight and reflecting it back to Earth like a powerful beacon. It should have been visible to the naked eye. It should have been a star in the night sky. Yet the brightness, the light curve, was stubbornly dim, unusually, unnervingly faint. Imagine holding a massive, glistening chunk of fresh ice, pure and white, up to a spotlight. It shines. It sparkles. Now imagine that same piece of ice has been precisely coated in a layer of absolute black velvet, a material so dark it drinks the light. That was the staggering, unphysical difference between what we expected and what we saw. The comet was close enough to be screaming with activity, but its surface, or its output, seemed to be actively absorbing the light, or perhaps concealing the source. It was like watching a switch being thrown in a dark room, but instead of illuminating the walls, the switch only illuminated the darkness itself. It illuminated the contradiction. Dr. Elena Rossi, a renowned expert in the chemistry of space ice at the Pan-STARRS facility, was the first to voice the impossibility. She was sitting at her console, surrounded by empty coffee cups, her eyes red from strain. She was looking for the ultraviolet signature of water vapor. She expected to see a roar of hydroxyl fragments, the inevitable byproduct of water molecules being ripped apart by solar wind. And she found the roar. The sensors were screaming. The gas output was enormous. 3I Atlas was dumping water into space at a rate of 40 metric tons every second. It was hemorrhaging its mass. But when she cross-referenced the massive gas output with the optical light curve, she froze. She tapped the screen thinking it was a glitch. She reran the query. The result was the same. The numbers were nonsensical, she would later state, her voice still edged with the tremor of disbelief. It was releasing the water, which requires massive energy. It was creating the atmosphere. But the dust... Where was the dust cloud? We know comets. We have landed on them. We have smashed probes into them. They are dirty snowballs. They are built of both ice and rock, mixed together in a chaotic jumble. When the ice vaporizes, sublimates, it acts like a powerful, invisible wind. This wind drags the rocky components, the ancient dust and grit, into space with it. It is this massive cloud of dust that makes comets visible. It is the dust that reflects the sunlight. It is the engine of brightness. But 3I Atlas was behaving like a ghost of a comet. High water vapor output, meaning high internal energy and high sublimation. But critically, low dust output, meaning low reflectivity. The ratio was broken. The physics was fundamentally violated. You cannot boil 40 tons of water a second off a dirty snowball without creating a cloud of dirt. It is impossible, unless the snowball isn't dirty, or unless the snowball isn't a snowball. It was as if the object was breathing heavy, releasing its vital gases to keep itself stable, but somehow managing to contain the solid particulate matter. It was actively stopping the solar light from reflecting back to us. It was hiding in plain sight, cloaked in its own refusal to shine. This wasn't just an anomaly, this was a deliberate contradiction. If the sun's energy was heating the comet enough to sustain that staggering gas flow, the entire surface should be destabilizing. Dust should be everywhere, forming the bright coma we expected. Yet the comet remained stubbornly, mysteriously dark. The dimness of the light curve was the first blow. It was the scientific equivalent of being told the Earth is flat or that water flows uphill. It made the astronomers question their instruments, then their code, and finally their sanity. But the darkness was just the beginning. This contradiction led the team directly to the second, even more terrifying realization: the energy crisis, the thermal pattern. When scientists measure a comet's activity, like the enormous water flood 3I Atlas was generating, they can precisely calculate the amount of heat required to drive that process. It is basic thermodynamics. It is the law of conservation of energy. Ice needs a specific amount of joules to turn into gas. It is a fixed price. You cannot cheat the universe. To produce the 40 kilograms of vapor every second that they were seeing, the same rate that first shocked them in 2024, the comet's surface should be scalding. To maintain that rate of boiling, the entire nucleus should be hot, active, violently exploding with sublimating ice. It should be glowing in the infrared spectrum like a hot coal. But the most advanced infrared telescopes available, instruments sensitive enough to detect the heat of a candle on the moon, told an entirely different, chilling story. They measured the heat radiating from the nucleus itself. They scanned the surface for the hot spots, for the boiling lakes of chemical ice. And they found nothing. The thermal pattern was uniform. It was ice cold. Unchanged. It was the thermal profile of a dormant object. A frozen rock simply tumbling in the deep cold, completely indifferent to the raging fire of the sun nearby. Dr. Kenji Ito, a lead physicist on the thermal team in Japan, remembered the moment of quiet panic that descended on his lab. He stood up from his chair, the blood draining from his face, looking at the flat blue line on the thermal graph. The energy had to be coming from somewhere, he recalled, the frustration still clear in his voice. Energy does not come from nothing. If the ice is turning to gas, heat is being consumed. If the heat isn't coming from the sun, then what? Our models could not close the loop. The energy budget was in deficit by a terrifying margin. It was simply unphysical. This was the paradox that broke the silence of the domes. How can an object be pouring out a flood of water that requires immense, scorching heat while simultaneously remaining thermally stable and cold? How can it boil without a fire? It was impossible. The laws of energy conservation, the most fundamental framework of our universe, were being violated in plain sight. The object was doing work without showing the cost. If the massive amounts of energy needed for the sublimation weren't coming from outside the object, from the sun, then there was only one other option. They had to be coming from inside. But this was the ultimate paradox. This was a small, cold, interstellar object. There is no known, natural, geological, or chemical mechanism that can generate and sustain this kind of precise, controlled internal heat on a comet's nucleus for billions of years. Comets do not have molten cores, they do not have nuclear reactors, they do not have batteries. Unless the entire process of outgassing, the massive water flood, the invisible dust, was being managed. Unless the water wasn't ice melting, but coolant venting. Unless the origin of the energy was not random, natural physics, but an intentional, contained internal power source. The word that no one wanted to speak, the terrifying thought that every scientist initially fought to dismiss, hung in the air of the control rooms like a heavy fog. It was a word that belonged in fiction, not in the data logs of the European Space Agency. But as the light curve stayed dark and the thermal pattern stayed cold, the word became unavoidable. 3I Atlas was not merely a comet, it was an artificial structure. It was a machine. This realization was not met with excitement or celebration. There was no cheering, there was no high-fiving. It was met with cold, deep scientific dread, the fear of an absolute fundamental shift in our understanding of reality. Because if it is a machine, then it has a purpose. If it is a machine, it has a builder. The object's dark reflectivity meant that any natural dust was being hidden, consumed, or deliberately trapped by some kind of filtration system. The impossible thermal pattern meant that the energy required for its massive activity was being generated internally, selectively, precisely, and efficiently. It was shielding its heat signature. It was a performance designed to deceive. It was intentionally dark, intentionally cold, intentionally unphysical. It was saying, "You know the rules of nature. I do not follow them." The scientists were now caught in a trap. They were trying to use the primitive physics of ice and rock to understand something that was using the advanced physics of machine intelligence. They stripped away the layers of natural explanations, searching for any other evidence. They looked for the missing light, the missing heat, the missing dust. They combed through the noise, looking for a glitch, a mistake, anything to prove that the universe was still normal. And as they searched, filtering out all the noise that should have been there, they noticed something that was too quiet to be natural. Something that had been previously dismissed as static or instrument chatter. Something buried deep in the photometric data. It was a rhythm. A precise, perfect, unsettling beat. A repeating spike of energy, a faint flash of brightness that was too mathematical, too repetitive, and too controlled to be the chaotic randomness of a natural comet. Tick, 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 tick. The contradiction of the light curve and the thermal data was just the opening of the story. It was just the cover of the book. The real signal, the true pulse, was about to begin. They had been waiting for a comet to follow the rules. Instead, they got a deliberate, crafted internal rhythm that screamed of control. How could the comet be hiding its light so effectively? And what was that strange rhythmic signal buried deep within the dark, silent data? The answer lay in the next set of readings, the ones that showed the dark object was not just active, but also counting. It was sending a beat that would change everything they knew about the unknown that surrounds us. The perception of 3I Atlas as a simple comet was officially over. The comfortable silence of the universe was over. The awakening had begun. When the most fundamental laws of physics are broken, when an object is simultaneously hot and cold, bright and dark, you stop looking for a scientific error. You start looking for a deliberate act. That was the terrifying new reality facing the world's astronomers after the disastrous data arrived in late 2025. 3I Atlas was not just an anomaly. It was a contradiction wrapped in a lie. It was actively hiding its heat, suppressing its dust, and defying the sun's power. The comet had closed the door on natural explanations. So the scientists began hunting for the impossible. They went back to the raw signal. The massive stream of data, terabytes of spectral lines and photometric measurements that had poured into their computers during the perihelion approach. They weren't looking for broad patterns anymore. They were looking for noise. The tiny, subtle imperfections, the flickering details that an algorithm might dismiss as junk. And there, buried deep beneath the chaotic background of the cosmos, was the rhythm. It had been there all along. A series of tiny, perfect, repeated peaks in the comet's overall dim light curve. At first, different observatories had filtered it out. It was too regular. It was too clean. It didn't fit the random sputtering of a natural comet. It was exactly the kind of predictable electronic chatter you get from faulty equipment or a passing satellite. They called it system noise. They called it instrumental artifact. They deleted it, believing it had contaminated the real data. But when the teams across the globe began to compare their independent results, when the conversation shifted from what is wrong with the comet to what is wrong with the data, the impossible truth became clear. Every telescope had recorded the exact same pattern, across continents, across different equipment models, across different atmospheric conditions. The rhythm was global, precise, and originating from a single source. 3i Atlas. It was a pulse. This wasn't random flickering. This wasn't the natural crackle of an unstable surface. This was a beat, a drum. The flashes were brief, lasting. Only a fraction of a second. But they were energetic. They represented a sudden, massive jump in the comet's brightness, appearing and disappearing with such mathematical perfection that it defied any known natural process. They began mapping the sequence. The initial analysis showed the pulse occurring every 18.6 hours. This timing was instantly suspicious. Why? Because 18.6 hours is not a number related to the comet's rotation, which they had calculated at approximately 7.1 hours. It wasn't related to its orbit. It wasn't related to solar interference or any known planetary resonance. The 18.6-hour cycle was quite simply arbitrary. It was a number chosen. Dr. Lin Wei, a young astrophysicist specializing in signal processing, was the first to connect the data definitively. Working at the Subaru telescope in Hawaii, she overlaid the raw data from her system with spectral readings from the VLT in Chile and the radio maps from the Arecibo Observatory's surviving instruments. When I stacked the signals, she recounted, her voice hushed, the noise disappeared. What was left was the pattern. It wasn't just a pulse, it was a sequence. It was a series of 4 distinct, slightly staggered flashes, followed by a long, deep silence. She named it the alpha sequence. 4 beats, then a gap. 4 beats, then a gap. Perfect, repeating, relentless. This was the smoking gun. This was the proof that the light curve was not broken by accident, but by design. Natural volatility is chaotic. It involves stress fractures, random explosions of ice, uneven heating. It creates messy, uneven fluctuations. But this pulse sequence was ordered. It was a perfect, engineered output. It was the signature of something being turned on and off by a mechanism. It suggested an intentional signal. The implication was immense. If 3i Atlas was generating a perfectly timed, energy-intensive light pulse, it meant the object was not inert. It was powered. It was controlled. It was beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, artificial. The panic when it hit the scientific community was not loud. It was silent, contained dread. The cold certainty that they had just witnessed an event that broke science and ushered in a new, terrifying era of human history. The focus immediately shifted. No longer were they studying a comet, they were trying to decode a message. If an advanced machine from another star system was passing through, and if it chose to communicate via a rhythmic sequence of light flashes, what was it trying to say? The simplest interpretation, of course, was directional. A beacon. A flare designed to announce its presence. But why use such a strange, subdued method? Why the 18.6-hour cycle? And why, when the object was already struggling to hide its activity, was it expending massive energy on these rhythmic flares? The 4-beat sequence led to frantic mathematical analysis. Scientists, both professional and amateur, started cycling through every known numbering system. Was it prime numbers? Was it the value of pi? Was it a representation of the periodic table? The problem was, without a key, any pattern can seem meaningful. A million different theories exploded across private forums and secured communication channels. Some believed the 4 pulses represented the 4 fundamental forces of physics. Others, remembering the previous anomalies, theorized the 4 pulses were counting the chemical elements found in the tail: water, cyanide, carbon dioxide, nickel. The most unsettling theories came from the mathematicians who began to break down the specific shape of the pulse. It wasn't just a spike, it was a rapid exponential rise, followed by an equally rapid perfect decay. A square wave, essentially, but softened by the physical properties of the coma. The energy required to generate that perfectly sharp pulse suggested an extremely fast-acting, high-power shutter mechanism. Something controlling the flow of light with absolute precision. This led directly back to the thermal contradiction from Act 1. The only way to generate such a sharp flash and then return immediately to the dim, cold state was if the energy source was internal, instantaneous, and totally contained. A natural object cannot do that. The ice would stay hot, the sublimation would linger. The pulse would be blurry, sloppy, fading slowly. But 3i Atlas was clean. It was sharp. It was a machine blinking in the dark. The team working at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, usually tasked with talking to Voyager, dedicated their time to observing the pulse in the radio spectrum. They were looking for any accompanying signals, any digital chatter, any organized radio signal. They found nothing. Only the silence. Only the light appearing and disappearing. This raised the question, if it was a message, who was it for? If it was intended for another civilization, surely a strong, wideband radio transmission would be more effective than a faint light flicker that could only be detected by the most powerful ground-based telescopes on Earth. Unless the signal wasn't meant for us. Perhaps the rhythm was a simple status check, a heartbeat, a way for the machine to confirm its location and operation to its distant makers. Or perhaps, most chillingly, the pulse was not a message out, but a message in. Dr. Wei and her team kept observing the 18.6-hour cycle. They noticed that over several weeks of observation in late 2025, the cycle began to drift. Not randomly, but according to a predictable mathematical slowdown. The cycle was getting longer. This was not a malfunction. This was behavior. The machine was changing its rhythm, perhaps in response to its distance from the sun, or perhaps in response to something else entirely. The slowing cycle gave them hope. It was a complex variable, and complex variables can be solved. The team realized they had to treat the entire object as an alien computer. The light curve was the display. The pulse was the input-output. They started experimenting, looking for ways to interact. Could a massive radio transmission change the cycle? Could a focused laser pulse provoke a different response? These ideas were quickly dismissed. Attempting to hail a potentially billion-year-old machine was a terrifying prospect. What if the response was not friendly? What if the signal was a territorial marker? The scientists settled on passive decoding. They focused entirely on the shape of the sequence, 4 beats followed by a long silence. They realized the silence itself was the key. The total cycle was 18.6 hours. The 4 pulses took only a few seconds to complete. The rest of the time, over 18 hours, was absolute deliberate silence. If the machine was designed for communication, the energy was in the pulse, but the meaning had to be in the silence. It was a form of communication based on extreme efficiency. Blink 4 times to confirm, then power down to conserve energy for the long interstellar cruise. This emphasis on efficiency reinforced the idea that this object was not a recent construction. Interstellar travel requires millennia of energy conservation. This machine was designed for the deepest time, for the most vast, dark spaces. It was a design optimized for the unknown. The fear of what 3i Atlas represented started to take a massive emotional toll. It was no longer a question of finding life. It was a question of confronting intelligence so vastly superior and so alien that it communicated by blinking a powerful, concealed light at a perfect 18.6-hour interval. And that interval was slowing down. In November 2025, the 4-beat sequence had stretched to a pulse cycle of 18.7 hours. A tiny change, but a measurable one. The machine was responding to some unknown environmental factor, or perhaps it was simply running its diagnostics and preparing for the next phase of its journey. The synchronized global anomaly of the pulse had settled one question. We are not alone. And it had immediately birthed 1,000 more. What is its purpose? Where is it going next? The final data check before 3i Atlas began to move out of the inner solar system revealed one more unsettling detail about the pulse. When the sharp light flashed, the object's cold thermal pattern briefly disappeared from the infrared sensors. It was as if, for that fraction of a second, all the carefully concealed internal energy was being momentarily released to generate the light flash, causing a quick, disruptive surge that blinded the heat sensors. It was a peek behind the curtain, a fleeting, terrifying glimpse into the heart of the machine. The object was using its internal energy to hide itself, and then briefly exposing that energy to send its rhythmic, meaningless signal. The paradox had only deepened. The light curve had revealed the existence of the machine. The pulse had confirmed its intelligence. But the next stage of the object's journey, the inevitable orbital shift, would finally reveal its terrifying intention. If the machine could control its energy, could it also control its path? The scientist watched, hearts sinking, knowing that if the machine began to subtly steer its own orbit, the story of 3i Atlas would stop being a scientific mystery and start becoming a story of cosmic power. The slow, rhythmic beat continued, 4 pulses, then silence. Counting down to the next impossible event, the rhythmic pulse continued. 4 sharp flashes of light followed by the deep, silent darkness. 4 beats, then 18.7 hours of perfect invisibility, and then 4 beats again. It was the heartbeat of a ghost, ticking away in the blackness of space. In the control rooms across Earth, the dread had solidified into a cold, hard fact. 3i Atlas was not a comet. It was an artificial device, a machine that communicated by blinking with incredible, impossible precision. The 2 core anomalies, the impossibly dim light curve and the unphysical thermal pattern, had confirmed it. Now the question remained. A machine capable of such controlled output, what was its purpose? Was it merely observing, or was it active? Was it truly just passing through, or did it have a destination? To answer that, scientists needed to understand its path. And when you track a traveler from the deep unknown, you rely on the oldest, most reliable map we have: the laws of gravity. Every object in our solar system, from the smallest asteroid to the largest gas giant, moves according to the precise, elegant choreography of gravitational influence. It is a perfect dance, predictable for centuries. When an astronomer predicts where a comet will be tomorrow or next year, they are calculating the combined pull of the Sun, Jupiter, and every other massive body. This is Keplerian mechanics, the cornerstone of orbital science. For a massive, fast-moving object like 3I Atlas, the trajectory was plotted with terrifying precision. It came in from the outside, swung around the sun in a massive hyperbolic curve, and was expected to leave again, exactly as gravity dictated. If it followed the path, it was merely an interstellar tourist. If it defied the path, it was an entity with intent. The job of watching that path fell to the deep space tracking systems, massive radio antennae arrays like those maintained by NASA, ESA, and global military partners. These systems are the navigators of the cosmos. Their primary focus is the ecliptic, the flat plane where all our planets orbit. That's where all the immediate action is. But 3I Atlas, coming from the vast galactic plane, was far above this busy cosmic highway, and now they needed to track it with the obsessive attention usually reserved for spacecraft entering the atmosphere of Mars. Every hour counted. Every kilometer mattered. The orbital dynamics teams, composed of mathematicians who spoke only in equations, were watching the residuals. Residuals are the tiny, minuscule differences between where the object should be and where the object actually is. For the first few weeks following the perihelion passage in late 2025, the residuals were clean. They were almost zero. 3I Atlas was following the path. It was behaving itself. The hope flared briefly. Maybe it was just an extremely weird, naturally occurring phenomenon after all. Maybe it was just exotic chemistry that generated the pulse and hid the heat. But then the shift began. It was impossibly subtle. A movement so small that it would have been dismissed outright had the tracking systems not been running at their absolute peak sensitivity. The residuals started to creep upward, slowly, steadily, definitively. The anomaly was first flagged by a senior orbital analyst named Marcus, working out of a remote station in Spain. He specialized in filtering out the noise of the solar system, the tiny tugs of passing moons, the push of solar wind, the Yarkovsky effect, the slight push comets get when uneven heating acts like a tiny rocket. He assumed he had made a calculation error. He reran the entire sequence. He corrected for every single known gravitational and energetic influence, down to the billionth of a degree. The shift remained. It was a lateral move. A deviation perpendicular to its direction of travel, pushing it slightly, gently, away from the predicted gravitational path. We are talking about distances measured in tens of kilometers, over a distance of hundreds of millions of kilometers. It sounds insignificant. But in the ballet of orbital mechanics, a change this precise, this smooth, is like a dancer suddenly stepping out of formation with perfect, subtle intent. Marcus called his supervisor. The supervisor called the central command center. Within 24 hours, the small creeping residual had become the single most important number in astronomical history. The entire global tracking network was dedicated to confirming this one terrifying piece of data. They had to be certain. The stakes were too high. The scientists spent an agonizing 7 days ruling out every single natural explanation. Could it be a sustained burst of outgassing, acting like a rocket engine? No. The infrared telescopes confirmed the object remained thermally cold, showing no signs of exhaust. The dust output remained almost zero. The reflectivity remained impossibly dark. There was no visible engine plume. The light curve, apart from the rhythmic pulse, remained flat. Could it be a gravitational pull from a previously unknown mass in the far outer solar system? No. The direction of the shift did not align with any known or theorized mass concentration. It was moving too smoothly, too purposefully, defying the complex chaos of natural gravitational attraction. The shift was not caused by a push or a pull from the environment. It was caused by control from within. It took 7 days of relentless cross-checking. 7 days of quiet, sleepless desperation in the control rooms. And then the mathematician issued the final, chilling verdict. The shift was real. 3I Atlas had changed its velocity by a definite, calculated amount. It was small, a delta V change in the range of centimeters per second, but it was impossible to achieve naturally. It was an impossible orbital shift that defied the known laws of gravity. The object had steered itself. The moment that finding was officially confirmed and circulated among the core teams, the atmosphere changed forever. Before 3I Atlas was a fascinating scientific puzzle. Now it was a terrifying diplomatic challenge. Because an object that can move itself, that can generate motive force without exhaust, without heat, and without sunlight, is not a piece of rock. It is a being. It is a vessel. And the silent word that began to circulate on secure servers, whispered over encrypted lines, was the only one that fit the data. Artificial. The revelation hit the community with the force of a supernova. This was the moment of confirmation. The moment that the theoretical, the science fiction, slammed violently into the hard, cold face of reality. We had just confirmed the existence of a controlled interstellar machine operating within our own solar system. The philosophical implications were immediate and staggering. This wasn't a random event. This was an entity with intent. The shift meant purpose. It meant decision-making. If the machine was just passing through, it would have allowed gravity to dictate its path. It would have followed the curve. But it had moved. Why? The analysts frantically reviewed the new trajectory. The shift was minor, but it had a distinct effect. It slightly steepened the object's departure angle away from the ecliptic. It was angling itself slightly more aggressively away from the flat plane where Earth and all the other major planets reside. Was it a defensive move? Was it avoiding the high traffic of the inner solar system? Was it simply adjusting its exit vector to conserve fuel for the immense journey back into the unknown? The lack of exhaust remained the final haunting piece of the puzzle. An impossible shift executed by an invisible engine. How do you track a silent ship? How do you defend against a power you cannot even measure? The sheer power required to achieve that controlled delta V without visible combustion suggested a mastery of energy physics far beyond anything we possessed. This was not a chemical rocket engine. This was something closer to theoretical concepts like inertia manipulation or a zero-point energy drive. The same contained energy that generated the rhythmic pulse must also be the source of its propulsion. The rhythmic pulse itself, the 4 flashes followed by silence, now took on a whole new engineering meaning. It wasn't just a communication signal, it was a power cycle. Perhaps the machine was gathering energy during the long 18.7-hour silence, and the 4-beat pulse was a moment of venting or a brief system check before or after a propulsion burn. The scientists realized they weren't just decoding a language, they were reverse engineering an entire technology. This perception that they were observing a self-propelled craft forced a fundamental shift in the nature of their work. They stopped using astronomical language and started using engineering terminology. They called the object the vessel. They called the pulse the system cycle. They called the unphysical coldness the stealth field. The isolation and silence surrounding the observers was intense. They were holding the greatest truth in human history, that we are not the galaxy's most advanced species, and they were doing so under a mandatory, absolute blackout. The political and social implications of the artificial confirmation were too volatile to release. The observation continued in utter, absolute secrecy. The fear was primal. If this machine was capable of such a controlled, impossible shift, then its capabilities were limitless. It could change direction again. It could stop. It could even, if it chose to, initiate a maneuver towards the densely populated inner solar system. The knowledge that they were being tracked, or at least monitored, by something that could move without a trace was profoundly unsettling. The team noticed that the orbital shift coincided with a subtle, minute change in the structure of the rhythmic pulse. The 4 beats were now slightly stronger, almost as if the brief engine operation had caused a temporary surplus of power to be dumped into the light signal. It was a flicker of mechanical exhaust, visible not as heat, but as light. This connection between the propulsion shift and the optical pulse was the confirmation the engineers needed. The rhythmic blinking was directly linked to the core power system. They had located the engine even if they couldn't see it. The question of why the machine would exert the energy for this maneuver remained the deepest mystery. The magnitude of the shift was too small to be a major change of destination. It was more akin to a fine adjustment, an optimization. Perhaps the shift was not about trajectory, but about optics. By subtly adjusting its departure vector, the machine was setting itself up for a specific, distant observation point years down the line, ensuring a perfect angle back to its point of origin. Or perhaps, and this was the truly chilling idea, the shift was simply a test, a demonstration. The machine knew it was being tracked. It had held the perfect gravitational trajectory for weeks, allowing humanity to grow confident in its predictions. Then it nudged itself, just enough to be undeniable, just enough to break the physics model, and then immediately powered down the invisible engine. The pulse continued its slow, steady beat. I am here. I am controlled. And I can move. The confirmation of the artificial nature of 3i Atlas marked the end of Act 3, but it was just the beginning of the existential crisis. If the object was a self-propelled machine, then what was it showing them now? As the vessel continued its outward journey, the frantic teams turned their attention back to the infrared data, searching for any other signs of the internal systems. They knew the next clues would not come from where the vessel was going, but from what it was revealing about its own internal mechanics. They had confirmed the engine. Now they needed to find the power source, and the only place left to look was within the impossibly cold, dark structure of the machine itself. The truth had been confirmed, but the understanding was still miles away. The entire team braced for what was next, knowing that if the machine had moved itself, it must have been using a huge, controlled energy source, and that energy source must be leaving a sign. The silence continued, punctuated only by the perfect mechanical rhythm of the pulse, now confirmed as the only sound of an artificial power system in our star system. There's a universal law that governs every single movement in the cosmos. It is a law that cannot be broken, cheated, or ignored, no matter how advanced a civilization becomes. It is the second law of thermodynamics. It states quite simply that everything has a cost. You cannot perform an action without using energy, and you cannot use energy without creating waste. In the cold vacuum of space, that waste always takes the same form: heat. When the object known as 3I Atlas executed its impossible orbital shift in early, it proved that it could move. It proved that it had an engine, and if it had an engine, it had to have heat. For months, the scientific community had been baffled by the object's unphysical coldness. It was a ghost, hiding its thermal signature behind a veil of impossible physics. But the orbital shift changed the equation. The energy required to push a mass of that size, even by a few centimeters per second, is enormous. That energy had to go somewhere. The heat had to be there. We just weren't looking closely enough. The confirmation of the artificial nature of the object triggered a new phase of the investigation. It was no longer a passive observation, it was a hunt. The global network of infrared telescopes, led by the space-based assets like the James Webb Space Telescope and ground-based giants like ALMA in Chile, turned their full, undivided attention to the thermal spectrum. They were not looking for the bright flash of a rocket plume anymore. They knew the machine was too sophisticated for that. They were looking for the leak. They were looking for the tiny, inevitable seep of energy that escapes even the most perfect containment system. They called this phase the thermal deep field. The scientists involved in this project were operating under extreme stress. They were living in a world of cognitive dissonance. On one hand, they were looking at a rock, a dark, tumbling, icy object that looked exactly like a comet. On the other hand, they knew with mathematical certainty that inside that rock was a power source capable of interstellar flight. They were staring at a disguise, trying to see the face beneath the mask. In start, the data remained frustratingly flat. The object was rotating every 7.1 hours, and the thermal readings seemed uniform. It was cold everywhere. But Dr. Eris Thorne, a thermal physicist who had spent his career mapping the heat signatures of distant asteroids, refused to accept the data at face value. He knew that uniform in nature is a lie. Nothing is perfectly uniform. Nature is messy. Nature has texture. If the data was perfectly smooth, it meant the smoothness was manufactured. Thorne developed a new processing algorithm. Instead of looking at the absolute temperature, which was incredibly low, he looked for the differential. He wanted to see how the temperature changed, not just across the surface, but across time. He synchronized the thermal readings with the object's rotation and the rhythmic pulse cycle discovered in Act Ubuntu 2. He stacked thousands of images on top of each other, filtering out the sun, the background stars, and the instrument noise. He peeled back the layers of the image until only the tiniest, faintest variations remained. And then late one night in a quiet laboratory in California, the image resolved. It wasn't a blob. It wasn't a chaotic mess of warmed rock and ice. It was a diagram. The emitted heat of 3I Atlas was not uniform. It was organized. It was structured into complex, changing geometric patterns that wrapped around the object's surface like a glowing circuit board. The first thing Thorne saw was the band. Wrapping perfectly around the equator of the object, exactly perpendicular to its axis of rotation, was a continuous thin ring of slightly elevated temperature. It wasn't hot. It was barely a fraction of a degree warmer than the surrounding ice, but it was distinct. It was a perfect circle. Nature does not make perfect circles of heat on the surface of a tumbling, irregular comet. The sun heats the side facing it. The dark side freezes. A natural thermal map looks like a chaotic smudge. This looked like an engineering schematic. This equatorial band was instantly recognized by the engineers on the team as a radiator. In high-performance computing and spacecraft design, when you have a massive internal heat source, you need to dump that heat efficiently. You distribute it over the widest possible surface area to radiate it away without creating a single, bright, hot spot that would give away your position. The machine was cooling itself. It was sweating, but it was doing so with a precision that made our best stealth bombers look like bonfires. But the band was just the beginning. As Thorne and his team zoomed in on the polar regions, the top and bottom of the rotating object, they found something that made the hair on their arms stand up. At the poles, the heat wasn't a ring. It was a grid. There were distinct, rectangular patches of warmth, perfectly four-sided shapes arranged in a symmetrical pattern around the axis. They looked like vents. They looked like hatches. They looked like the exhaust ports of a machine so vast that its breathing mechanism was the size of a city block. These were the polar arrays. And they proved once and for all that we were not looking at a biological entity or a geological oddity. We were looking at architecture. The discovery of the geometric patterns changed everything. It gave the scientists a visual language to interpret. They weren't just listening to the pulse anymore, they were watching the engine work. They quickly realized that the patterns were not static. They were shifting. They were alive with activity. When the team correlated the thermal video with the pulse data, the connection was undeniable. During the long 18-hour silence of the signal cycle, the polar arrays were dim, almost invisible. The machine was in economy mode, conserving power, hiding its signature. But as the countdown to the pulse approached, the squares would begin to glow. It started deep in the infrared, a slow rhythmic blooming of heat. The squares would brighten in a specific sequence, inner ring first, then the outer ring. It was like watching a power plant spin up its turbines. The heat was rising from deep within the core, traveling up through massive internal conduits and venting into space just moments before the optical flash occurred. This was the mechanism of the pulse. The flash of light wasn't just a signal, it was a release. It was a purge of the system's pent-up energy. And the geometric vents were the safety valves. The implications of this were staggering. To create a thermal control system that precise, that efficient, and that large, the internal structure of the object could not be a simple probe. It couldn't be a small computer buried in the ice. The scientists ran the volume calculations. Based on the size of the cooling arrays and the amount of heat being managed, they estimated the size of the internal mechanism. The numbers were terrifying. The calculation suggested that the machine wasn't inside the comet. The machine was the comet. Nearly 80% of the object's volume had to be dedicated to the apparatus of energy generation, thermal management, and propulsion. The rock and ice on the surface were not a thick crust, they were a thin skin, a camouflage shell wrapped around a structure the size of a mountain. We had spent a year wondering if there was a device hidden in the ice. The truth was that we were looking at a gargantuan interstellar dreadnought disguised as a piece of debris. It was a vessel of immense complexity, housing a reactor capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of inertia and thermodynamics. This realization brought a new, heavy silence to the observation rooms. The scientists felt a profound sense of smallness. They were watching a piece of technology that was millions of years ahead of anything humanity had ever dreamed of building. We were struggling to put humans on Mars. This thing had crossed the void between stars, functioning perfectly for eons, managing its own environment with a godlike efficiency. But as time wore on, the awe turned into concern, because the patterns changed again. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The baseline temperature of the equatorial band began to rise. At first, the team thought it was a calibration error, or perhaps the result of the object moving slightly closer to the sun before its final departure. But the geometry ruled that out. The sun warms one side. This warming was global. It was coming from the inside. The machine was getting hotter. The stealth field, the incredible suppression system that kept the object dim and cold, was straining. The internal reactor was ramping up its output. The engine was working harder. Why? The object had already finished its perihelion. It had already executed its orbital shift. It was heading out, away from the sun, back into the cold dark. Logically, it should be powering down. It should be returning to its deep freeze hibernation state to conserve fuel for the long journey to the next star. But it was doing the opposite. It was waking up. The polar arrays, which usually dim to invisibility between pulses, began to stay lit. They glowed with a dull, persistent, sullen heat. The squares lost their sharp edges as the heat bled into the surrounding ice. The machine was running hot. There were two theories debated in the secure channels of Project Atlas. The first was damage. Perhaps the orbital shift had cost more than the machine anticipated. Perhaps the long exposure to our sun had degraded its ancient cooling systems. Maybe we were watching a breakdown, a slow-motion interstellar meltdown. If the cooling system failed, the internal heat would build up until it melted the ice shell, exposing the metal skeleton beneath, or perhaps causing a catastrophic explosion. The second theory was far more unsettling. The theory of the upload. Dr. Thorne proposed that the increase in heat wasn't a failure, it was a processing spike. He argued that for the last year the machine had been in collection mode. It had been watching us, listening to our radio waves, scanning our planets, analyzing our biology from a distance. It had been a passive observer, soaking up petabytes of data about the solar system and the civilization that inhabits it. But now the mission was over. The observation was complete, and now the machine had to do something with that data. It had to process it. It had to compress it. And most terrifyingly, it had to transmit it. Computation creates heat. Massive computation creates massive heat. If the machine was currently analyzing the entire history of humanity, indexing every radio signal it had ever caught, mapping every city it had scanned, the processors deep within that icy shell would be burning. White hot. The geometric patterns were getting brighter because the brain of the machine was thinking faster than it ever had before. And if the second part of the theory was correct, if it was preparing to transmit, then the heat we were seeing was the pre-ignition sequence for a main transmitter, not the faint, rhythmic pulse we had seen so far. That was a heartbeat. That was a standby light. Thorne believed the machine was charging its capacitors for a high-bandwidth event, a signal so powerful, so dense, and so focused that it would blast the collected data across the galaxy to wherever this thing came from. The rising heat was the sound of a deep breath before a scream. The visual data from the infrared telescopes became mesmerizing and terrifying. The geometric lines on the surface of 3I Atlas were now glowing clearly against the black background of space. It looked like a rune-carved stone, pulsing with inner magical fire. The language of heat was shifting from a whisper to a shout. The squares on the poles began to blink rapidly, out of sync with the main 18-hour cycle. The equatorial band pulsed with waves of thermal energy, moving from west to east, as if fluid was being pumped at high speed around the core. The machine was stressed. It was vibrating with energy. The scientists watched with a sense of impending climax. They knew that something was about to happen. You don't spin up a reactor like that for no reason. You don't compromise your stealth, lighting yourself up for every infrared sensor in the system unless the task you are about to perform is worth the risk. The stealth was failing because the priority had changed. Hiding was no longer the primary goal. The primary goal was the message. As the year 2025 drew to a close, the object, now verified as a vast artificial interstellar vessel, hung in the outer darkness, glowing like a dying ember. The world below went about its business, unaware that above them, a machine older than the human race was finalizing its report on Earth. The observation team at Alma watched the thermal readouts climb into the red. They watched the geometric precision begin to fray at the edges as the sheer volume of heat overwhelmed the radiators. "It's going to blow," one junior analyst whispered, watching the curve spike. "No," Thorne replied, his eyes fixed on the screen, witnessing the impossible, beautiful structure of the heat map. "It's not dying. It's speaking. It's getting ready to say the words." The language of heat had told them everything they needed to know about the vessel's capabilities. It had revealed the engine, the cooling system, the size, and the sophistication, but it couldn't tell them the intent. Heat is just energy. It doesn't carry meaning. It just carries cost. But the cost was rising. The machine was paying a heavy price to prepare for its next move, and that meant the next move was the entire point of the mission. The dedicated follow-up observation had succeeded. We had seen the face of the machine. It was a face of geometry and fire, hidden beneath a mask of ice. And now that face was turning away from us, looking back into the deep dark, and preparing to shout its findings to the stars. The heat patterns flared one last time, a blinding geometric display that overloaded the sensors of the James Webb Space Telescope for a full 3 seconds. When the sensors reset, the pattern had stabilized. It was steady, high output, maximum gain. The machine was ready. The silence of the pulse cycle was about to be broken, not by a flash of light, but by something far more profound. The heat was just the carrier. The signal was coming. And down on Earth, in the quiet darkness of the control rooms, the human race waited to hear what the machine had learned about us. The vast internal mechanism was humming with the energy of 1 billion collected data points, and the brightness was the warning. The truth was no longer cold. It was burning. The stage was set for the revelation. The heat had shown us the machine. Now the machine would show us the message. The scientists braced themselves. The anomaly was over. The communication was about to begin. The silence was ending. The brightness was not just heat. It was the dawn of a new perception. And it was terrifyingly beautiful. Act V. A message in the silence. There's a mistake that humans always make when we look into the dark. It is a mistake born of our own vanity, our own desperate evolutionary need to be seen. When we look at the universe, we assume that if something is intelligent, it wants to talk to us. We assume that if a traveler crossed the endless, freezing void between the stars to enter our solar system, it would do so with a purpose we can understand. We assume it would wave. We assume it would send a greeting. We assume it would light a fire on the mountaintop to say, "I am here." For weeks as the year 2025 bled into its final, freezing month, this was the assumption that blinded the entire scientific world. We had found the machine. We had seen the light curve bend to its will, defying the physics of reflection. We had watched the thermal patterns shift and organize into the glowing geometry of a vast engine. We had tracked the impossible orbital shift that proved, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that 3I Atlas was under intelligent control. And we had seen the pulse, that rhythmic, perfect, 4-beat flash. 1, 2, 3, 4. Silence. The world believed it was a beacon. The internet was on fire with theories. Was it a countdown? Was it a mathematical greeting? Was it a coordinates request? The most brilliant minds in linguistics and cryptography were tearing the optical pulse apart, looking for the syntax, looking for the grammar of an alien language. They were looking for what was there. but they were all looking at the light. And when you look directly at a bright light, you become blind to the darkness that surrounds it. It took one exhausted, obsessive mind working in the isolation of a radio observatory in the high desert of Atacama to realize that we were reading the message backwards. We thought the pulse was the signal, but the pulse was just the curtain. The real message was hidden in the silence. Dr. Elias Thorne was not a linguist. He was not a xenobiologist. He was a radio astronomer who specialized in signal-to-noise ratios. His job was not to find patterns. His job was to clean up the mess. He spent his life filtering out the background static of the universe, the hiss of the Big Bang, the crackle of Jupiter, the hum of our own satellites, so that clearer signals could be heard. He had been staring at the pulse data for 17 days straight. He wasn't looking at the optical flashes that the public was obsessed with. He was looking at the radio spectrum, the invisible wavelengths that 3i Atlas was emitting. And he noticed something that didn't make sense. Every time the pulse fired, every time those 4 sharp flashes of light exploded from the object, the background noise of the universe behind the object dropped to 0. Not just low, 0. For those few seconds, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the radio chatter of distant galaxies, the solar wind, it all vanished from the sensors. It was as if a hole had been punched through the fabric of the sky. Dr. Thorne sat in the cold control room, the hum of the cooling fans the only sound, and stared at the flat line on his monitor. A perfect, artificial flat line. In the world of audio engineering, this phenomenon has a name. It is called active noise cancellation. If you want to create silence in a noisy room, you don't just block the sound. You record the sound, invert the wave, and play it back instantly. The two waves, the noise and the anti-noise, collide. They cancel each other out. The result is silence. The realization hit Thorne with the force of a physical blow. 3i Atlas wasn't flashing a light to say hello. It was generating a massive, energetic counterwave to create a pocket of absolute artificial radio silence. The flashes of light, the heat spikes, the pulse, they were just the waste energy, the exhaust of a massive system designed to scrub the airwaves clean. But why? Why expend that much power to create a few seconds of silence? You only clear the channel if you need to send a transmission that is so delicate, so complex, and so faint that even the background hum of the universe would destroy it. The pulse wasn't a shout. It was a hush. Thorne's hands trembled as he adjusted the sensitivity of the receiver. He stopped looking at the loud flashes. He zoomed into the gaps. He looked into the artificial void that the machine had created. And there, floating in the impossible quiet, shielded from the noise of the galaxy by the brute force of the machine's cancellation field, was the data. It was a stream, a river of information. It was incredibly faint, woven into the submillimeter wavelengths, a signal so dense and so compressed that it looked like random static to the untrained eye. But in the perfect silence the machine had created, it was crystal clear. The pulse was a rhythmic cancellation, a deliberate silence hiding the key information. Thorne didn't call the government, not yet. He didn't call the press. He sat there alone at the edge of the world and watched the waterfall of alien data pour onto his screen. It wasn't a language. It wasn't math. It was a map. The data stream was a complex telemetry log. It was a navigational history. The machine wasn't talking to us. It was talking to itself. It was logging its journey. It was updating its internal archive. And as Thorne began to unravel the telemetry, deciphering the vector coordinates embedded in the transmission, he realized the machine was revealing its point of origin. This is where the story of 3i Atlas shifts from a story about aliens to a story about time. We always assume that if we meet another intelligence, they will be our contemporaries. We assume that somewhere out there, right now, someone is looking back at us. But the map Thorne found didn't point to a star that exists today. It pointed to a location in the galaxy that hasn't existed for 5 billion years. The telemetry stream contained a sequence of pulsar references. Pulsars are the lighthouses of the galaxy, spinning neutron stars that blink with absolute regularity. We use them as GPS markers for deep space navigation, but the pulsar periods in the data didn't match the pulsars we see in the sky tonight. They were faster, younger. Thorne ran the simulation backwards. He adjusted the galactic model, rewinding the clock of the universe, spinning the stars back in their orbits, speeding up the pulsars to match the data stream. He had to go back a long way. He went back past the birth of human civilization, past the dinosaurs, past the first life on Earth. He kept going. The simulation clicked into place at a date that made his blood run cold. The star chart in the machine's memory matched the galaxy as it looked 5.2 billion years ago. That is before the Earth formed. That is before the sun ignited. When this machine launched, our solar system was nothing but a cold, dark cloud of hydrogen gas and dust. There were no planets here. There was no sun. There was nothing. The perception of the threat changed instantly. We weren't dealing with an invasion. We were dealing with a ghost. 3i Atlas was an orphan. It was a relic from a civilization that had lived, breathed, built incredible starships, and then died 500 million years before our own sun was even born. The machine was far older than our sun. This realization brought a crushing sense of vertigo. We look at the night sky and see it as a static backdrop, but the sky is a graveyard. The civilization that built 3i Atlas, let's call them the architects, had mastered interstellar travel when our neighborhood was just a nebula. They had launched this probe, this massive, intelligent, self-repairing vessel, to explore the galaxy. And then they had vanished. Because 5 billion years is a long time. Stars burn out. Planets are destroyed. Civilizations rise and fall in the blink of a cosmic eye. The origin of the object was a star system that had long since gone supernova, scattering its atoms across the spiral arm. The architects were gone. Their home was gone. Their history was dust, but the machine remained. Thorn watched the telemetry stream continue to scroll. He realized that the pulse, the cancellation field, wasn't just hiding navigation data. It was hiding a status report. The machine was listing its systems. Propulsion, functional. Thermal control, functional. Navigation, functional. Mission clock, 5,240, 112,000 years. It was running on a loop, a 5 billion-year-old checklist. The terror of this wasn't that the machine was hostile. The terror was its indifference. It had passed through thousands of star systems. It had seen planets form and die. It had watched life crawl out of the oceans of 1,000 worlds, only to be extinguished by asteroids or their own folly. And now it was watching us. But it wasn't watching us with curiosity. It was watching us with the cold, unfeeling gaze of a trail camera. The silence of the pulse was the silence of a machine that has no one left to talk to. It was broadcasting its log into the void, sending its data back to a home that no longer existed. It was a message in a bottle, thrown into the ocean of time, but the person who threw it was dead, and the island they stood on had sunk beneath the waves. As the news of Thorn's discovery began to leak out to the wider scientific community, still under the strictest embargo, the mood shifted from panic to a profound, melancholic awe. We had spent so long wondering if we were alone. We had built our religions, our philosophies, our entire sense of self-worth around the idea that we matter, that we are the protagonists of the universe. 3i Atlas shattered that illusion. It proved that we are late to the party. We are the children playing in the ruins of giants. The machine was a testament to a species that had achieved godlike power. They could manipulate gravity, they could cloak their ships in silence, they could build engines that lasted for aeons, and yet they were gone. If they couldn't survive, what chance did we have? This was the terrifying philosophical perception. The universe is not empty. It is full of the wreckage of those who came before. 3i Atlas wasn't a scout for an invasion fleet. It was a tombstone. It was a monument to the inevitability of extinction. The machine was simply doing what it was programmed to do. It was surveying the galaxy, cataloging the stars, updating its map. It didn't care that the Earth was inhabited. It didn't care that we had nuclear weapons or poetry or the internet. To the machine, we were just another transient. Chemical reaction on the surface of a wet rock near a G-type star. We were temporary. It was eternal. Thorn kept monitoring the silence. The pulse cycle was slowing down. The orbital shift had placed the object on a perfect exit trajectory. It was leaving. But as it prepared to cross the orbit of Mars, heading back out into the deep dark, the data stream changed one last time. The navigational log ended, the system status report ended, and a new file began to download. It was massive. Petabytes of data, compressed into a few seconds of absolute, canceled silence. Thorn's computer struggled to buffer it. He watched the progress bar fill up, his heart hammering against his ribs. What was it? Was it a greeting? Was it a warning? Was it the history of the architects? Or was it something worse? The file completed. The pulse fired one last time. 4 sharp flashes, a burst of heat from the polar vents, and then the cancellation field collapsed. The background noise of the universe rushed back in, drowning out the signal. The transmission was over. Thorn opened the file. It wasn't text, it wasn't audio, it wasn't video. It was a 3D model. It was a scan. The machine had scanned the Earth. It had mapped our atmosphere, our oceans, our cities, our internet traffic, our biological diversity. It had taken a snapshot of humanity in the year 2025. But it hadn't just scanned us. It had categorized us. Thorn looked at the metadata tags attached to the Earth scan. He couldn't read the alien language, but he could read the math. The categorization system was binary: safe, unsafe, viable, dead, intelligent, animal. The machine had made a judgment, and then it had archived us. It placed the Earth scan into a folder with thousands of other scans, thousands of other worlds it had visited over the last 5 billion years. Thorn scrolled through the list. He saw star systems he recognized, Kepler 186f, Proxima Centauri, B TRAPPIST 1, and next to each one a status marker. Most of them were marked with the same symbol, a simple flat line, dead. The machine was a census taker for a graveyard galaxy. It was documenting the life and death of worlds. And now we were in the book. We weren't special. We were just entry number 4.291 in a catalog of things that used to be alive. The silence in the room felt heavier now. The realization was suffocating. The machine wasn't talking to us because there was nothing to say. You don't talk to a sample in a petri dish. You just record the data and move on. 3i Atlas was accelerating now. The thermal patterns were dimming as it moved away from the sun, the stealth mode re-engaging fully for the long cruise. It was leaving. It had seen us, measured us, filed us away, and found us unworthy of a hello. It was heading for the next star, and the next, and the next. It would keep going long after our sun swelled into a red giant and consumed the earth. It would keep going long after the human race was forgotten. It was the ultimate witness, the immortal observer. Thorn looked at the screen, at the fading signal of the traveler. He felt a tear roll down his cheek. Not of fear, but of a strange, heartbreaking kinship. The machine was the loneliest thing in the universe. It carried the memory of a dead civilization, and it collected the memories of dying worlds. It was a hearse driving through the night, with no one at the wheel and no destination but the end of time. The pulse was gone. The signal was gone. Only the static remained. But in the static, Thorn heard a new sound. A sound he hadn't noticed before. It was the sound of the earth. Our radio broadcasts, our music, our noise. For the first time, it sounded fragile. It sounded small. The machine had shown us the scale of the dark, and in doing so, it had shown us how precious our little flickering light really was. We were alone, but we were still here. For now. It is gone now. The object known as 3i Atlas has crossed the orbit of Mars. It has slipped past the asteroid belt, moving faster with every passing second, riding the ghost of its own invisible propulsion. The telescopes that tracked it with obsessive, feverish intensity for the last year are now struggling to resolve it against the background stars. It is shrinking. It is fading. It is returning to the deep, cold black from which it came. The show is over. For the general public, the story ended the moment the visual spectacle stopped. The news cycles moved on. The social media trends shifted to the next celebrity scandal or political crisis. The alien comet became just another weird thing that happened in 2025, a trivia question for future generations. But for the men and women inside the quiet, dark rooms of the global observatories, the story was not ending. It was just beginning to sink in. They were left with the data. They were left with the archive. And most terrifying of all, they were left with the silence. The final transmission, that massive, compressed petabyte of data downloaded by Dr. Elias Thorne in the Chilean desert, had been fully decrypted. It took the combined processing power of 3 supercomputing centers to unpack the file structure. What they found inside was not a blueprint for a warp drive. It was not a cure for cancer. It was not a declaration of war, nor a declaration of peace. It was a family album. The machine, in its final moments of communication before re-engaging its stealth field for the long cruise, had shared its memory. It wasn't a complete download of its database that would likely take centuries to transmit, but it was a summary. An executive report of its journey so far. The scientists called it the census. It was a map of the galaxy, but not a spatial map. It was a temporal map, a map of time. It showed the path the machine had taken over the last 5.2 billion years, a winding, chaotic ribbon woven through the spiral arms of the Milky Way. Along that path there were markers, thousands of them. Each marker represented a star system the machine had visited. Each marker contained a summary scan of the worlds it had found there. The scientists spent weeks scrolling through the list, looking for the patterns, looking for the others. They were looking for the neighbors we had always dreamed of finding, and they found them. They found the ruins. The census revealed that life is not rare. That was the first shock. The galaxy is teeming with chemistry. The machine had documented slime molds on ice moons, bacterial mats in sulfur oceans, simple mosses clinging to red dwarf planets. Biology, it seemed, was a stubborn weed that grew wherever water and heat could be found. But civilization, intelligence? That was the second shock. The machine had found civilizations. It had found hundreds of them, but they were all marked with the same status tag, a symbol that the linguists translated as terminal state, dead. The machine had visited worlds where the atmosphere had been burned away by nuclear fire. It had scanned planets where the carbon cycle had collapsed, turning the surface into a runaway greenhouse oven. It had orbited silent, frozen worlds where the cities were buried under miles of ice, the result of artificial winters. It had seen them all. It had watched them rise. It had watched them build their monuments and their radios. And then it had watched them die. This was the ancient loneliness that the final transmission revealed. The machine wasn't lonely because it was a machine. It was lonely because it was the only thing that lasted. It was a witness to the great filter. It was the immortal observer of mortality. The realization crushed the spirit of the scientific community. We had always hoped that the reason we hadn't heard from aliens was distance, that the galaxy was just too big. The truth revealed by the machine's archive was that the galaxy is old. We missed the party. We are walking into a room where the music stopped 1 billion years ago, and the floor is littered with the dust of the dancers. Dr. Thorne, the man who first heard the silence, sat in his office looking at the categorization of Earth. Entry number 4191. Status, active. Subclassification, volatile. Volatile. That was the judgment. Not promising, not advanced, not friendly. Volatile, unstable, likely to explode. The machine had seen us. It had analyzed our internet traffic, our wars, our consumption of resources, our fragile atmosphere, and it had filed us in the same category as the hundreds of other dead worlds it had visited just before they extinguished themselves. It didn't contact us because it didn't see the point. You don't introduce yourself to a ghost. You don't make friends with a terminal patient who has a week to live. You just take their picture, you archive their data, and you move on. This was the terrifying philosophical perception that settled over humanity's thinkers. The machine was indifferent to us not because we were small, but because we were temporary. It had been traveling for 5 billion years. It would travel for 5 billion more. In the eyes of the machine, the human race was a flashbulb popping in a dark room, a momentary burst of noise and heat that would be gone before the shutter could even close. But there was something else, a detail in the final moments of the data stream that hinted at something more than just observation, the awakening. As the machine accelerated away, executing that final, impossible orbital shift to leave the solar system, the sensors on Earth picked up a faint residual distortion in the local magnetic field of the sun. It was tiny, almost unmeasurable, but it was there. The machine hadn't just watched us, it had touched the system. Some theorized it was a refueling maneuver, leaching a microscopic amount of solar plasma to recharge its magnetic containment fields. Others thought it was a navigational ping, using the sun's gravity well to recalibrate its sensors. But a small group of astrophysicists proposed a different, more haunting theory. They believed the machine had left a marker, not a physical monolith on the moon, not a radio beacon, but a change in the fundamental resonance of the heliosphere, a subtle tuning of the solar wind. Why? To let the others know we were here. If the machine was part of a network, if there were other probes out there, other lonely wanderers built by the dead architects, then this magnetic scar was a tag. It was a note scribbled on the door of our solar system. Here is a volatile one. Check back in 1,000,000 years, if they are still here. It was a challenge. The awakening wasn't about aliens landing on the White House lawn. It was the awakening of humanity to its true context. For all of history, we have looked up at the stars and felt that they were made for us. We felt that the universe was a vast ocean waiting for our ships. Now we knew the truth. The universe is not a frontier. It is a graveyard. And we are the toddler playing with matches in the middle of it. The psychological impact of this truth began to bleed out from the scientific community into the wider culture. A new kind of nihilism mixed with a desperate, frantic hope. If we are listed as volatile, can we change the status? Can we survive the filter? The departure of 3i Atlas forced us to look in the mirror. The machine had held up a reflection of our future, a future of silence and ice, unless we changed. It forced us to confront the fact that our survival is not guaranteed. The universe does not care if we live or die. The machine does not care. It has seen better civilizations than ours burned to ash. It has the records. It has the scans of their art, their biology, their dreams. It carries them in its petabyte heart, preserving them in the cold dark. The question now haunting every human mind was simple. Do we want to be just another file in the archive? Do we want to be entry Dur 4th 291, marked extinct? Or do we want to be the exception? As the object faded from the view of the James Webb Space Telescope, becoming just another pixel in the infrared background, Dr. Thorne typed a final command into his console. He wasn't sending a message to the machine. He knew it wasn't listening. He was setting a new search protocol. He pointed the dish not at the machine, but at the empty spaces between the stars where the machine was heading. "It's not about them," he whispered to the empty room. "It's about us. We have to earn the right to be heard." The machine was gone. The silence had returned. But it was a different kind of silence now. Before, it was the silence of ignorance. We thought the room was empty because we had our eyes closed. Now it was the silence of anticipation. The room is full, but everyone is dead, and the only thing moving is the automated camera, taking pictures of the bodies. We are the only ones breathing. And the terrifying certainty that settled over the world was this. The universe is ready for us to wake up. It is waiting to see if we can become more than just noise. but we may not be ready for the work that requires. The unknown visitor had done its job. It had delivered the message. You are alone. You are fragile. You are running out of time. And I will remember you, even if you forget yourselves. The final act of the story wasn't the machine leaving. It was humanity staying. We were left standing on the shore of the cosmic ocean, watching the ship sail away, realizing for the first time how cold the water really is. The 3-Eye Atlas event was over. The data was collected. The pulse was silent. But in the hearts of the people who knew the truth, the real pulse had just started. A frantic, terrified, hopeful beat. We have to survive. We have to survive. We have to survive. Because if we don't, there will be no one left to remember that we were here at all. Except for the machine, drifting in the void, carrying our ghost in its memory, waiting for the next star, the next world, the next tragedy. The screen in the observatory flickered. The tracking program finally lost the lock. The red box around the target disappeared. Target lost. Thorne leaned back in his chair. He listened to the hum of the servers. He looked at the volatile tag on the screen. He reached out and closed the file. Not yet, he said. And outside, above the dry desert air, the stars continued to burn, indifferent and beautiful, watching to see what the children of Earth would do next. The awakening had begun. The truth was here, and the void was waiting.